Greetings, pilots, and welcome to Flight Academy. My name is Kovakis, otherwise known as Flyteco and Switchor, and today we're going to be continuing on with our ship breakdowns. And today we'll be covering the Clarion/Empyrean. These are the weirdest ships of the strike class. They don't really fit into the predefinition of what a strike feels like. For the most part, they are a pseudo support ship, as its systems aren't really buffs. They're more like auras to an extent, where two of them are flat out a team wide buff, and the last is a sort of. It's used more offensively nowadays, and we'll get into that when we get there. Moving on, we have some decent primary choices. I don't really like all of them, but they're all really decent actually. I'm kind of struggling with the Clarion right now myself, as I'm trying to see why this ship is so unique. People are generally kind of upset that the ship can do what it can. Mostly with the remote slicing system, and we'll get into that when we get there, and kind of why. I'll give you both sides of the argument, and you can formulate an opinion on your own, as I believe that biasing people is a bit of an annoying thing to do. Um, I don't actually want to go over the primaries, mostly because I think they're all decent choices, and frankly, with this ship in particular, the systems and secondary weapon kind of fill the same role that the pike does, whereas the primaries, they feel it's a strange feeling to say the least, where my primaries are extremely useful on this ship, but they don't feel as useful as they do on other ships. Even the pike, like primaries there feel slightly more impactful. Here they feel like just kind of a nice little thing to have, where you're really playing you're playing such a different style that I almost sometimes find myself not firing my primaries as much as I should, and that's a fault of my own and not really a reflection of the ship. What I will do for you guys is I will kind of give a brief overview of what each choice does, and I'll give you their tier 4 and tier 5 capstones, and we'll kind of move on swiftly through them, as I don't believe they need too much explanation, as I've explained every single one in the past, at least I believe to a decent bit of success. So quad lasers, they're a good mid-range option. Realistically, that's all they fill on this ship. They don't really fall under any niche or anything like that. For tier 4, you're going to take your reduced power cost. That is the right side yellow one. And for tier 5, you're going to take increased hull damage. Once again, crit on this ship is slightly more viable with a particular build, although that particular build is extremely weak currently, and I believe that is to. That one might be due a bit more to balancing than anything. I believe crit is just kind of weakened GSF already, and full diving into the crit build on this ship doesn't actually feel strong, as it doesn't have the main crit option that another ship has that we'll get into eventually. But unfortunately, the crit build isn't great here either. Tier 5, you're going to take increased hull damage, as you normally would. Moving on to light lasers, this and rapid laser kind of fill this. Actually, I will bunch these two together as they're literally the same weapon. And what I'll do instead is explain the difference between the two. So they both fill the same range and more or less do the same thing. Similar damage profile, similar kind of outlook on how they're meant to be used. The difference between the two, light laser does not have armor piercing or armor penetration, and as such, has a higher damage base. And rapid fire does have armor piercing, so as such, it has a lower damage base but a higher rate of fire. For both of them, if you're going to take either one, you're going to want to take improved firing arc and tracking and improved hull damage. This will just let you track people a little bit easier and deal more damage once you finally get past someone's shields. Moving swiftly on to secondary weapons, this requires a little bit more of an in-depth dive, as there are a decent chunk of options in here. I'm going to cover 3, as I highly recommend watching my Pike video. When it comes to anything secondary related, that is generally the best place to find more or less the generic spread of things. Once we get into scouts, that changes a little bit. But I'm not covering ion missiles. I believe they are too weak in the current meta, and on this ship in particular, do absolutely nothing for you or your team. On the Pike, they feel weak just because the Pike has better options. On the Clarion, they feel useless because the Clarion is just better. It kind of does what ions do without. The only thing the ions give you on this ship is shield stripping, which you don't need. Your damage values on the ship, your flat damage, not even just before amplifying or anything, are high enough that shields don't really. They're not really the thing that's stopping you from killing someone. The thing that's stopping you from killing someone is generally like movement based things. As the ship is, it feels slower. That's really its only downside though. So ions don't really do anything for you, unfortunately. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna move through ships, or I'm gonna move through each option, in the order that I believe that, in the order that I use them in. These are all strong options, and I highly suggest you kind of experiment around with between the builds and all that stuff to see what you like the most. But my number one choice is thermite torpedoes. This is the first time this has popped up on any of the ships we've looked at so far. Within the strike fighter category, this is essentially the twin to proton torpedoes, but in a different flavor. What this does is it does less damage and has a longer duration damage over time. But what it does is it debuffs the enemy instead of directly doing hull damage. And what that does is it'll do 20%. It'll just flat out reduce the damage reduction of the enemy, meaning any armor they build is useless as long as you hit a thermite torpedo, which is why actually quads and light lasers are extremely good on this ship. Unfortunately, again, I don't seem to fire my primaries enough on this ship. I think I need to change that to make the ship good. But if you hit someone with a thermite, both of these now gain armor penetration, and they also gain shield penetration of approximately 20%, which is really strong, especially in the quad lasers, where their damage is so high that it's just slapping through and doing a lot. Plus, that debuff lasts the full 15 seconds duration, equivalent to the dot as well. And the extra layer to this torpedo is it does out heal, or it does more damage than the Hydra Spanner crew ability, can actually out heal, and it does execute damage. So once you break an enemy's shields, the dot damage is now doing 150% more damage against hull. It does 150% more on impact as well. But generally speaking, you want to fire this before you even attempt to clear shields, because you'll probably kill them with the shield penetration and armor penetration. You'll probably kill them before their shields even disappear. So you're going to be getting that hull damage, the hull damage spike really quickly on the dot, and that's really good for an execute. I find that I kill people more often than not with the execute damage than I do with my own primaries with this ship. It is on a particular build, as the build that people complain about on this ship. I don't abuse it per se, but I do use it a lot as it feels really smooth. Once again, when we get into systems, I'll get into what that is and all that stuff. But overall, I believe thermite torpedoes is it's not the best choice from a raw damage standpoint, but I believe in terms of a hybrid damage / utility option, this fits the Clarion perfectly. It melds perfectly with what the ship really is. It's a hybrid damage support ship. It's meant to do a bit of both while accomplishing both, I'd say, very well in terms of how it is meant to be laid out as a strike fighter. Sorry, I'm just reading my notes real quickly. I believe I covered everything on this missile. There's not too much that we'll get into here. When we get into systems, I will explain a lot more in there. Yeah. Tier 4 for this, you're going to take increased firing arc. This is the same argument as proton torpedoes. You really just want that extra bit of arc so you can track people a little bit easier. They actually have a very similar firing arc, so that's why I made the comparison at the start. They are essentially the same torpedo, just with different effects. And tier 5, you're actually going to want to take increased duration. I know it's going to be tempting to take plasma warhead, as it's just going to do more damage. However, you're getting 3 extra seconds of your damage over time, which is essentially adding damage to it. You're getting longer on your shield bleed through and the armor debuff, which means they're just taking damage for 18 seconds instead of 15. And that's more likely than not unsurvivable for people, unless they somehow just are able to sit on a repair probe completely undisturbed, which should never happen if you're chasing someone. I mean, when are they going to be able to stop? They might get like 2 ticks from a healing or from a repair probe and then kind of have to continue moving. So overall, this is my personal best option for thermite, or for my secondary option. I like it the most, and as such, I use it the most. Moving on, we'll move into a bit more of a utility option before covering protons, as protons are more or less the same as thermites. So EMP on here is it's dabbling more into the utility focus than it is the pseudo damage support kind of focus, and as such, it's not really meant for the damage oriented things. It's meant more for the aggressive kind of healer focus, where you take the healing systems and kind of set up for your teammates rather than actually kill yourself. So if you're going to run EMP, your chances are going to be running the repair probes, and as such, you're going to be getting few kills, but you're going to have a very high assist tally if you play correctly, so there's still a victory there. The main concern here, though, is it does still have a really long reload time at nearly 9 seconds. It makes it really hard to want to use this missile. However, I think the EMPs are just good enough that it really just it balances out enough that I think it's good enough that you can use it on this as a main missile and get away with it. It's very close though. As such, I would recommend using the damage option. However, I personally, if I'm ever running a healer for a team, which I haven't done in a while, but when I did, I'd run EMPs just because I think if you're going to be healing people, you're not going to have the damage output to really kill people, because you're kind of already losing out on the offensive systems that you could otherwise have to enable yourself. So there's that. For tier 4 and tier 5, you're going to want to take increased damage at tier 4 and engine suppression at tier 5. Engine suppression is essentially what lets you set up for your teammates. If you land an EMP, the enemy no longer can use their engine ability, and now your team can lob missiles at the enemy fairly freely. Moving on to proton torpedoes, this is essentially the same argument for thermite, except very different. This is the just raw damage variant. You pair this with remote slicing, the same as the thermite torpedo. You kind of run it in the same fashion. The difference is proton torpedo has longer range at tier 5 than thermite torpedo does, but thermite torpedo has a lasting effect where proton torpedo doesn't. Proton torpedo is essentially just a burst damage option. It just does straight 800 hull damage, and if your opponent doesn't use any healing abilities, it does 200 extra damage to hulls. However, like I say, this gets countered by things like Hydra Spanner and other fairly low ask healing abilities, so it does have its pros and cons. Its main downside is it provides very little utility that isn't just the utility of killing an enemy. That's the only thing this does, really. And as such, it fits under the ship decently, but I don't believe it fits the archetype that the ship is kind of presenting to us. That said, it is still a strike fighter, so if you want to play it hyper aggressive, you can do so. just know you don't have the options down here that do the same thing that don't enable Proton to do the same thing as it would on others. That said, the same applies to Thermite, so the argument there is kind of moot. At tier 4 and tier 5, you're going to want to take increased firing arc at tier 4, same argument for Thermite Torpedo, and increased range at tier 5. This is mostly just because you want the extra little bit of range, because the ship, while being extremely safe, it's not particularly it doesn't feel the fastest, and it certainly isn't to my knowledge. And its engine options are kind of quirky, so you really want to stay far away from people before you engage on them with primaries and other things like that. There is an argument, though, and this is the first time I can say this, to take increased ammo capacity, so you have 12 ammo on here, to keep it in line with Thermite Torpedo, because you actually have decent staying power on the Clarion, as you have a nice bit of survivability with certain system choices and crew choices, and there's a lot you can get done with this ship. And I have found myself running out of secondaries on this ship more than I have any other ship for some reason, and I believe that it's entirely just it survives for a lot longer than others can. So you can actually take increased ammo capacity here. Your range will be slightly smaller, but it stays in line with Thermite Torpedo, so if you're used to that, you're used to this. They're more or less the same torpedo. If you play one, you'll play the other with decent succession. Just you'll have to change up your weapon choices a little bit if you're moving from Thermite to Proton. So there is that. Moving into the systems, and the most polarizing issue on this ship. I'm going to go through all three of them, as I believe they all have use. I'm going to actually go in a kind of a weird way. I'm going to talk about repair probes first, combat command, and then remote slicing. I'm talking about them in this order, as remote slicing I'm going to talk about a lot longer, as there's some issues with it, but I'll speak about that when we get there. So repair post is up first. This is your number one support choice. This, however, is not telling you to be a point support. And what that means is things in like domination, you are not sitting on a point and healing people. In TDM, you're not sitting with gunships and healing them. You are still being aggressive, and you're staying with strikes and other aggressive ships, and you are healing them on the move. You're trying to essentially stay in line with your teammates as best as you can, and get a decent chunk of them to get healed and to just replenish their ammunition and stuff on the move. That said, you can just straight up heal yourself as well, and that's totally fine. One thing to note is this can just about out heal almost all damage over time effects. However, this is less effective against burst things like proton torpedoes, stuff like that. It is good against the proton dot, which is of note, as it heals, I want to say 120 every 4 seconds, so essentially 30 a second. So it is keeping up just barely. I think I want to say proton torpedo, the dot is out damaging it by a little bit, but it's not too big of a deficit that you'll straight out just die from the dot. You will live. Granted, you will be very low, but it's another way to counter proton torpedoes if that's what you're really looking for. For your tier 4s and tier 5s, you're going to stick to the left side. Never, ever, ever touch shield options on healing choices, as replenishing shields in GSF is a terrible idea. They do not have the same effective health as Hull does, and healing a Hull means you can just survive. And since shields already regen, there's no reason for you to do anything to other people's shields. So as such, you're going to take improved repair, which adds just another 20 heal, so you're already 100 heal, so it's bringing it up to 120. Meaning you're healing 60 a second instead of 50, which doesn't sound like a huge buff, but in GSF, every point counts, as it is a very weird damage sort of mode. So it's doing well. And you're going to take refill ammunition. This is essentially the way that you keep scouts from running out of the rocket pods, and just keep yourself and other strikes topped off with torpedoes and missiles, and overall just keep your team well stocked with supplies. It's a good option. I personally have ran it in the past. I don't run it anymore as I don't really run with a team, which is where this shines a lot better. If you're running with a group of 4 and you're just going in essentially fire teaming it, you'll be pretty far off and you'll get a little bit more mileage out of repair pros than you would in a solo environment. Moving on to Combat Command, this is meant as your aggressive support system. It's not a bad buff. It's a lot of primary focused buffs, which is kind of unfortunate. It increases primary accuracy by 10% for 20 seconds, decreases power draw by 10% for the duration, and it will restore 5 weapon power every 4 seconds. So kind of a weird amount per 4, but essentially think of it as you'll restore 20 over. Actually, sorry, you'll restore 25 weapon power over the duration, which is decently effective. The main place where this would be useful, if it didn't have the primary weapon restriction, would be gunships. But since it is exclusively restricted to primary weapons, this loses out on a lot of usefulness, as it's, like I said, it's not a bad buff, but it kind of suffers from the lack of long engagements. The current meta is a lot burstier, and you're going to find yourself either dying quickly or just able to escape easily. There's not really the in-between that this wants. You're not really going to get value out of the full 20 seconds, so you're going to eat maybe like 4 or 5 seconds out of this, and then it's just going to be on cooldown for a good 60-some seconds. So it's not the worst. I just don't think it fits in the meta right now. If you are going to take this, remember it's actually very good with scouts and strikes, more so strikes than I would say scouts, as it's particularly the Starguard. You have a Clarion and a Starguard team up, and you can just make the Starguard more consistent, then that's good. That said, Repair Probes fits the same role, and it just makes the Starguard tankier. So it's a good option if you want to try it. It's a lot more team comp oriented than the rest, so definitely focus on that. For tier 4 and tier 5, these are extremely team comp focused, and this is where the idea of the crit build flourishes. And this is the one place where if you want to run the crit build that badly, you still shouldn't do it, because this isn't the best crit buff in the game. But what it does do is you can either take increased weapon power, which is the more generic buff that you want to take. This is good in almost all situations, as it increases maximum weapon power. This is the only thing that isn't associated to the primary weapon, that and the power regen, but it's not a good enough buff for you to warrant still using it on gunships and stuff like that. You still want to be using it on strikes and scouts. Or you could take crit chance. This is if your team is just the worst and all of you want to run crit builds. I particularly recommend using this with the Flashfire if you're going to run with a pairing, so like you and a duo, because the Flashfire is the crit ship. It's the only ship in the game that really should be running crit with no penalties, and this helps it a little bit more by giving it all the net. This is actually perfect for the Flashfire. If the Flashfire didn't already have amazing systems, this would be the better option. But if you have a Clarion and a Flashfire, you can get the best of both worlds, where the Clarion picks up Combat Command and the Flashfire picks up its crit buff, and you can just do a lot with that. On the tier 5, you're going to be wanting to take improved power regeneration on the generic side of things. Generally speaking, you're going to want to stick to either the left or the right. The exception being, actually no, that is not the exception. There's no exception. If you're running with a generic composition, left side is your best bet. If you're running with the Flashfire crit build kind of team comp oriented thing, where you're picking a scout and you're essentially pocket buffing it and kind of making things impossible for the enemy team, you're going to want to take the crit chance, and then improve targeting, which is another primary weapon accuracy buff, which the Flashfire loves. So if there ever was a duo composition for aggressiveness, this is probably the better choice, especially since the Clarion can still benefit from both of the crit and accuracy with quad laser cannons. You essentially just swap out for the crit damage and crit chance. That said, that makes it a burstier option. It doesn't make it a good way to sustain fight people, so just be warned of that. You will run out of weapon power really quickly, so you're going to want to be sitting in that weapon power adjustment for most of the time if you're trying to fight with this. Moving on to by far the most polarizing option in the systems tree, remote slicing. What this does at base, it will slice someone. The range isn't listed. I want to say it is near to the 5,000 to 6,000 meter range. I've never been able to fully test it, as it's very hard to tell ranges in game while you're focused on just fighting the enemy. But it feels like 5,000 to 6,000 meters. If I were to say, it's probably closer to 5,000 than the 6,000. So what this does is it will, at tier 1, no upgrades, no nothing, it will just drain 60 points of engine power immediately, which is a lot, by the way. Engine power is fairly low. It's 125 on most ships, I believe, without the power pool buffs or anything like that. So you are eating a significant chunk of their engine. I mean, that's a little under half for most ships. And it will also drain 40 points of shield power per second, which is, as we found out on the Starguard, it is just straight up eating through their actual shield. So that's pretty solid. But what it does later on, as we kind of go through the tiers, this becomes better and better. Its cooldown is fairly low, and in fact, it's the lowest of any of the systems to start out. And it gets lower. It goes down to 25 seconds at tier 1, mind you, which is really strong. At tier 2, it'll drain more shields, which is really nice. At tier 3, it just increases the duration from 9 seconds to 12 seconds. So that's 12 seconds of that shield drain, and then the quick little burst of engine reduction. And then at tier 4, you get two options. You get to either reduce weapon power reduction, or you get to reduce weapon power. This is maximum weapon power, meaning their capacity will just be removed, like flat out. So if they're regenning, it'll be 20 less than it normally would. This is always bad because if you're ever taking anything that affects weapon power, you're essentially submitting to a fight where you're trying to gain a resource advantage instead of a physical damage advantage or anything like that. And I believe that in the state that GSF is in right now, we're not having long fights where weapon power matters. So you're not going through multiple weapon power pools where this will matter. So the other option is engine power reduction, which synergizes amazingly with the first part of remote slicing. Because what you are doing is you are immediately taking 60 of their energy and then saying 40 of that is effectively sticking, and then 20 of that you're just never getting back while this is on. So you are making people just flat out, you're making it harder for people to run from you by just flat out saying they have less engine power, which is really strong. I can't state how many times I personally have been countered by this, as it makes boosting feel pretty much like useless against the Clarion. Escaping a Clarion isn't hard. It is challenging, but it's not the hardest thing in the world. And at tier 5, and this is the number one reason that I personally believe that people complain about it, is it has engine suppression on here. And the issue for that, and the reason I personally believe people complain about this the most compared to any other EMP type effect. Number one, the effect for remote slicing by itself and at tier 4 is already really strong. That doesn't go without saying. But adding engine suppression to an auto-targeting ability, which has essentially zero ask from the user, aside from a range that you need to be in, is really strong, because this essentially tells you that you can walk up to someone, suppress them, and just lay into them with torpedoes. and there is practically nothing they can do about it. I've noticed with the Clarion more than any other ship, really, including the Nova Dive, which, in my opinion, has always been the staple for EMP effects. I've been able to hunt gunships, which are notoriously elusive, as they will barrel roll at the first sight of a missile locking onto them and will immediately just run away from someone. And generally speaking, it'll take your entire engine pool to even reach the gunship to begin with, so chasing them is very challenging. This just says no. This stops the gunship from leaving. This stops them from escaping you with their engines. This kind of just shuts gunships down, and that goes with that. That goes for every other ship class as well. It just kind of shuts them down, and while it's not shutting them down in terms of like their ability to move per se, it is shutting them down in terms of their survivability, because they no longer can escape your torpedoes, and they no longer can run away from you for as long as they normally would. The main argument for people is the effect is too strong for it to be by sort of a point and click kind of thing, where you essentially just target someone and you affect them. The other half of that coin, and this is coming from people that are more in line with my line of thinking, and this is why I think remote slicing is fine, and that's why I refuse to say I'm abusing it, because it is strong. I will admit it is very strong. However, I don't believe it is broken, because you can still escape a Clarion by using mechanics in the game. You can line of sight the Clarion, and the remote slicing becomes useless, because if you're in a loop where you have tight enough corners that you can continuously stay out of line of sight of the Clarion and just essentially wait out the remote slicing, that's now half. I mean, their cooldown is going to be low, so it's going to come back up fairly quickly after the fact. But if you kill them in that time that their remote slicing is now off of you, and you have free time to just fight them, you can win really easily. And even so, most Clarions will always. Clarion's players have become predictable. Any Clarion running remote slicing is instantly noticeable, as they will run remote slicing, and they will run the whatever. I don't remember which character has it. It's the one that like Slicer's Loop. They run Slicer's Loop to reduce to just completely shut off your regeneration, meaning you can't escape, and they will fly to you, remote slicing loop, and then try and fight you. The counter to this is spacing. If you stay out of their range, which feels for both like about 5,000 meters, at most 6,000, you have a good chance of just turning around and fighting them. If they do get both off on you, your new plan becomes to evade them with terrain, and that is the most viable survivable option. Even against other ships, not like the Clarion, you will always abuse terrain in a way that keeps distance between you and your enemy to avoid from missile locks or primary weapon fire. So, this long rant to say, I believe that remote slicing is in a good enough spot to where all Clarion players can use it, but the other systems are not overshadowed by it. You can still run repair probes on Clarion and feel extremely successful. It does require a little bit more effort to do so, and remote slicing is extremely easy. I can tell you right now, it is extremely easy to use and feels wonderful. But it is not the end-all be-all build for the Clarion. I'm in a way that if I fly a gunship against the Clarion, and I know there's a Clarion in the enemy team, I mean, they'll probably kill me once, because I'll be shocked, because I generally don't check enemy compositions if I'm flying solo, because you don't really have to if you're not paying attention to team compositions, because there's usually not too many teams nowadays. But if I know there's a Clarion, I will always know how they're going to fly at me. They are almost always going to try and straight line it towards me to get their slicing and slicing loop on me. to shut me down and keep me from escaping. So what I do is, the second I see a ship fly straight at me, I will focus all of my target. I will focus my first either ion or plasma shot. We'll get into that when we get into gunships. But I'll fire my first gunship, or I'll fire my first railgun shot, and then proceed to engage upon them with burst lasers or whatever other weapon and close range weapon I'm using at the time. This can catch many Clarion players off guard, because most gunship players at the sight of anyone will just flee immediately. But if you play aggressive into someone, this is now suddenly unexpected. You are doing what they didn't expect you to do. Will you probably eat a missile? No, because there is another counter that isn't stated in the line of text. There is the shield ability, which I will just open my quarrel now. Distortion field, which effectively, at tier 3, will disable a missile lock. It won't disable a missile or it won't break a missile lock, so you can't escape a missile that's already been fired, but you can keep them from firing that missile to begin with. With clever use of distortion field, you can straight up just hard counter Clarion and fight them in that close range that they're not comfortable with. And that's where I believe, I hate to say it, but I that's where I believe people just aren't skilled enough in GSF to know that counter exists and to use it to its fullest effect. Because myself and a fair few gunship players have had good success against Clarions. Is it hit or miss? Yes. There are times where a good Clarion player can very much so shut down everyone on the field, and it will feel insurmountable. But there are also times where people will hear about how busted this one build is, and they'll try it out, and they won't know quite the niches that it requires to make it feel insurmountable. So you really just kind of have to learn the matchup. That's really what it comes down to. Yes, it is asking players to specifically tailor themselves to a specific build, but you don't see Clarions enough for it to be too bad. But you also see them enough to where you kind of have to know that this exists. So this is my warning to people watching this video. If you get hit by remote slicing, hope you learn to fly well, because 90% of countering this ship is just good evasion. That's the thing you'll learn throughout your entire career at GSF, that evasion is the number one way to live in this mode. It is a flying game mode, and as such, you need to use your flying to the best of your ability to fight your enemies. So moving on from that long rant, we'll get into the shields. For this, once again, kind of keeping in line with most of the strikes, we have a couple of relics of a better time. That in the form of charge plating and directional shield. These just don't have a place in the meta anymore. They had their own metas way back when. Charge plating in particular used to dominate a time when people didn't want to just... I honestly, the time was so long ago that it's fairly insignificant now, that it doesn't affect current GSF in any way that makes sense. You'll see charge plating run on bombers every once in a while, because some people still think that's good. That said, directional shield also not that great, so your third option is essentially shield projector. This falls in line with the pseudo aggression support thing that the Clarion has going on, and kind of adds to the survivability of yourself and teammates. What this will do is it will restore 32% shields over 6 seconds, so essentially 6% per second. Sorry, not 6% per second. It's like 5 point something percent per second. You get the point. It's a flat little shield bump to yourself and 3 allies, and it will cleanse things like ion or EMPs and stuff like that. So it's actually a really good way to counter EMP effects, like remote slicing. Fun fact. Its buffs are kind of flat and don't do too much for it. It has a cooldown reduction, and will actually... Okay, this one is important. It will increase, at tier 2, it will increase the number of allies by 2, so you can actually hit 5 allies instead of 3, meaning you can have 5 people survive longer, and it will increase the radius from 5,500 to 6,000, so it gives you a little bit of leniency with how many people you can land this on. Tier 4, you're going to want to take increased duration. What this is going to do is it's going to make the shield regeneration last another 4 seconds, so from 6 to 10, giving you an extra 16% shield regeneration strength, or shield regeneration, which is nice. Overall, this is a good enough survivability buff that it kind of keeps you topped off through a fight. This is a little more focused towards longer fights. However, in short fights, it's actually a nice enough survivability buff that it's still good in those scenarios. In a world where the meta shifts and everything suddenly starts one-shot and everyone starts one-shotting each other, you're going to want to take Power Burst instead, just to get that extra little bit of shields just straight off the bat. But I don't think that meta is going to come along anytime soon, so for now, increased duration will get you by far and will keep you alive a lot longer. Moving down to engines, we have got some really weird options in here. I believe that something needs to be said about the joys of barrel roll and how simple of an option it is, and how much it really makes you miss it on some ships. Retro thrusters only appears on 2 ships, so that's like a rare case. Although retro thrusters is a good engine, barrel roll is a lot more common, and seeing barrel roll on a ship is generally good because it's a safe option. What's happened with the Clarion is it has gotten none of the safe or easy options, and instead went all out for the sort of weird options. Power converter is straight off the bat terrible. Interdiction drive on this ship is garbage. It provides nothing for you minus a speed boost, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't have an engine, it doesn't have a missile break anywhere, where even the power converter has one at tier 3, which is hilarious. And it's not affecting, it's giving you a speed boost and making enemies slower, but it is not doing that in a way that is useful to you. It's doing it in a short enough range that if an enemy is already within this range and you pop interdiction drive, you're gonna probably already be dead because there's gonna be a missile lock on you now, and you have no other missile locks. So this is your one slot to get it, and by having 2 options that are practically useless to you, the ship starts to feel like it's suffering. And then when we look at the other 2 options, we come with another issue. I'm going to go over these 2 choices in depth, being Power Dive and Koyagrin Turn. I have some massive issues with these engine choices, and I'll get into that after I explain Koyagrin. But for now, Power Dive. This is the more offensive of your 2 choices. It has a very high difficult. It has a very large and kind of weird learning curve that just kind of has. It's a bit high of an ask for an engine, in my opinion. Its movement pattern, if you look at the image here, a power dive, you imagine it is a sharp 90-degree turn down, but this is not that. This is an arch 90-degree turn, meaning you essentially push out vertically and kind of dive into the turn, as the name suggests. My main issue with this is it is not turning your ship downwards, meaning you are not flying forward and then just kind of going down. You're flying and rolling 180 degrees and then continuing the turn backwards, essentially, from where you were facing. That's my number 1 gripe with this turn. It's a really weird movement. It really doesn't fit within GSF, in my opinion. I understand it is a thing that happens in real life, and it's probably a thing that works out. But in GSF in particular, we have some really weird maps, and more often than not, terrain in GSF is finicky at best with its hitboxes. That said, the fact that this moves you forward into the turn, while annoying, is acceptable. It makes sense physically and in a spatial presentation. Of course, you have to be really careful that you don't hit anything on the way forward into your turn. My number one issue is when you turn backwards, you are essentially blind to the terrain that you were near instead of seeing the terrain that you could have hit. And that can lead to a lot of confusion because if you die on the end of the power dive to something that is now under you, that would have been in front of you had you turned just a straight 90 degree. Essentially a straight 90 degree turn, which you can already do yourself, by the way. You will be confused because suddenly this piece of terrain has hit you and you don't know why. And that to me is a bit annoying. If this turn was different, I'd be okay with it. I'm fine with the forward movement. That's not an excuse. Koyogrin does that. Like almost every turn has some form of forward movement, even retro thrusters technically. But the way in which it turns you is not good. It's acceptable for something like Koyogrin. It's not really good here. So, with that said, and I really hate to say this, it is the best option if you want to play aggressively on the Clarion. That said, at tier 3, you're going to pick increased turning rate. The one thing I will admit that Power Dive does have for it is it has a really low cooldown. It's like 12 seconds at tier 2. So it's not the worst, but I really just hate how this engine moves. It feels really clunky and weird, and out of all the options in the game, it feels out of place. Only a few ships ever run it because those ships don't have better options, unfortunately. If this ship had anything, if it had barrel roll on it, I believe this ship would be incredible. It would really just amp up the style and kind of make this ship feel and flow well. But instead, it got power dive and Koyogrin. Moving on to Koyogrin, it is essentially like retro thrusters in the sense that it works similar. What this does is it pushes you forward and kind of rolls you backwards, upside down. This makes sense as if you turned like this, you would curve backwards and be upside down at the top of the turn. So as such, you'll be upside down. A nice little buff or a nice little thing that Koyogrin does is it actually increases your accuracy for 4 seconds after the turn by 50%, which is a pretty significant amount. So if you can turn around and kill someone, it's nice. It doesn't come into play as much as you would think, but it's cool when it does. And overall, this is your quote-unquote defensive choice. You can use it offensively in the same way that you would use retro thrusters. It is a little different because the way you use this compared to retro thrusters is you fly through your enemy and then Koyogrin, so you turn around to face them again. But overall, it faced the kind of a similar thing. And I would argue Clarion is a little more creatively oriented than I would tend to give it credit for. It is a good engine option. Of course, it was on any ship that has this and another, unlike barrel roll or retro thrusters, I wouldn't pick it. But on ships that kind of are limited like this, I think it's really nice. I personally still use Power Dive. This is mostly because Power Dive can be used technically to gain a bit of speed boost if you like quickly snap up and then use Power Dive to move forward again. But that's a niche, so I honestly on the ship would recommend Koyogrin. It's not bad. It feels kind of the similar role as retro thruster, so it's not bad. Tier 3, you'd take increased turning rate, and that's pretty much it for that. like I said I was gonna go over it at the end of the thing, but instead I went on the rant on Power Dive. Um, that's my main issue. My main issue with this ship is it really feels kind of haphazard in its construction of its builds. It feels really seamless and smooth up here. I mean, primary weapons feels kind of weird. You have some really weird choices for this ship, but like overall they're okay and acceptable and work very well for the ship. Your secondaries are solid with the exclusion of ion missile. I mean, that's just useless everywhere, so that's unfortunate there. All the systems are amazing. Remote slicing is cool. This is the only ship that gets remote slicing, so that's neat. I'm pretty sure it's the only ship that gets repair probes too, so these have some really cool and unique applications. Shields, I mean, these all had their these two had their moments to shine, and shield projector's just good now, so I'm fine with that. But the engines just feel too janky to like really feel comfortable with. With Koyagrin being the best option technically, I don't feel like this ship was quite thought out the way it should have been. I mean, interdiction drive, I see the logic behind it, but they really just needed to find some way to integrate a missile break into this thing, because it fits thematically with the ship. It's a self buff and enemy debuff. That's what the ship is technically meant to be accomplishing, but it is not doing the one thing that you need engines to do in breaking missile locks, which you really need. I mean, there's literally no way to do it anywhere else in the ship. It's not like Scouts or any other ships like that where you have distortion fields to help you out of bad scenarios. So, all that said, uh, minor components and crew are going to be in my builds guide. Quick note for crew: their Wingman and Hydra Spanner are probably your two best options. Wingman is actually interesting for the crit build because it's just more accuracy. So I'm dead set on saying the Flashfire Clarion crit builds could be really good. I've personally never tried it because generally speaking, I'm the Flashfire player, so unfortunately, I've never had a Clarion to pocket me, nor have I really wanted to pocket someone as a Clarion myself. So, that is Clarion for you. Like I stated, it's a good ship. Remote slicing's nice. It's got a lot of unique builds, and overall, I think it is cool. And of course, out of all the Republic side ships, I think it looks the best. I love the look of it. It's the closest thing we have to like an X-wing. In fact, it looks. If any of you've seen like the Clone Wars, actually, if you've just seen the Clone Wars or like Star Wars Episode 3, this looks a lot like the. I want to say it's the BARC ships. It looks similar to those, and I love those ships, so they look cool. But that is all for this one. We will be continuing on into the Scouts. We'll be kind of doing them in the same sort of style where I go down. I will note this now, since we've gone through an entire ship archetype. I'm going to be doing Scouts, then gunships, then bombers. This is due to two reasons. Number one, I'm not a bomber player, and number two, I believe gunships are a little more important and integral to the current GSF space than I do bombers are, and as such, I believe bombers need to be brought up a little bit earlier. If I were to tier the way that these were layered, it's similar to this, except bomber and gunship are swapped. That's really all that is. So, with that, good luck out there, pilots. I'll see you in the skies, and have a wonderful day.